Welcome to the Keto Geek Podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low carb life.
Birthplace of the human race, an evolved species like none other, capable of great accomplishments and catastrophes. In the human quest to end world hunger, a bigger problem has dawned. For the last 50 years, obesity and chronic conditions have been on the rise. Together, we shall form an alliance and put an end to this madness. For I have witnessed the human capacity for courage and dedication. And if you are listening to this message, know this. Only you have the power to stop Oreobot before it is too late.
Who was that?
I think that was Optimus.
Sounded more like Stannis Baratheon.
Stannis. Oh, yeah, Stannis.
It must be Stannis.
It's always Stannis.
It was always him. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 50th episode of Keto Geek! It's been a huge journey and a big milestone. You guys listening to us, buying our products, everybody. You guys are amazing. And so a lot of people were interested in this episode. They were like, hey, who's going to be on our show? And so today is a very special episode. And we're going to have a lot of fun. You guys will enjoy it, definitely. But we need to do a little bit of a house cleaning before we get into the show. But these are some important topics that I really wanted to touch bases on. First of all, how are you, Corey?
Doing pretty well. Loving this awesome autumn weather in California. It's amazing.
Winter is coming.
I know.
Stannis is already here, I guess. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are currently, again, I think every week we mention Amazon, that we're slammed on it. So right now we're currently sold out again.
I've nicknamed it Slamazon.
Slamazon Festival. Mm-hmm. So when we will be back, please go to our newsletter or subscribe to any of our social media. We announced that, okay, this is the day we're going to be back on Slamazon. So we are really happy to tell you that our business is growing completely to an insane level. There's a lot of wholesale requests, and a lot of them have been put to the back burner at the moment because we can't meet up with Amazon, let alone go to wholesale across the globe. It's not just about United States anymore. We got interest from Australia. We got interest from Canada.
And Holland as well, I heard yesterday.
Yeah, we got a Holland some in there as well. So you guys are amazing. We are in for a crusade of changing the food industry, promoting a positive message. And so with this podcast, with our product, it's going to be a huge journey and a huge milestone. Let's change the world.
With that said about wholesale, if you guys know about a really cool retailer in your town and you'd like to see the energy pods there, maybe you should open up the conversation and possibly pass them on the information that we are selling our wholesale now.
And the link to the wholesale application account is in the show description as well. And speaking of our show, guys and gals, we are bringing the Keto Geek podcast back on YouTube. So if you've been listening to us over there, you will be seeing more content as well. And we recently did a second live stream. That was really good. People had gave us good feedback. And so YouTube live streams are coming next, finally. So that's something to watch out for. Our Keto Geek show is going to go totally insane pretty soon. So yeah. And then there's a lot of other things that I wanted to talk about. And so, for example, one of the things that is really people want to know about is satiety. And so there's this whole new can of worm that I wanted to open. I don't know if I should open it on the podcast. I think we'll talk more about it during our live stream, because this is already a huge show as is. It's literally more than an hour and a half long.
Yeah, good idea.
So join us at our Keto Geek live streams when it goes live, and we will be talking more about our backstage work. So another tiny tweak that we will be making to our product specifically, and we talked, Corey, briefly about it, is that we will be adding a stabilizing agent to our energy pods very soon, but we will be very precarious about the science behind whatever we're going to add. The problem we were facing currently is that the ingredients over time have the potential to separate, especially in some of the warmer climates.
Yeah.
And we want the product to remain mixed up. Now, a lot of other food companies use things like trans fats. We will not use those at all.
That's cheating.
That's cheating with human health.
Yes.
Don't cheat. So we will definitely be adding something that will bind the ingredients in a much better way. So, but we'll keep you guys posted on that on, like I said, social media and on our newsletter as well. Corey, do you have anything else to add here?
We just want to make sure that we give you guys the absolute and most best product, and you always trust us to look for the best and most recent scientific studies pertaining to the ingredients that we used in the energy pods. So, of course, we're going to make sure these things are amazing through and through for all of you.
Definitely. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a long, kick-ass podcast ahead. Our guest is super amazing. And today, the person who will give the description, hey, Statins, you want to pick it up?
I can do that.
All right. Looks like Statins is going to be doing our narration for who our guest is. So, take away, Statins.
After obtaining a degree from the University of Leeds in English and philosophy, Nick MAILER co-authored the first book in UK on the education possibilities of the internet. He co-founded the Positive Internet Company and founded the campaign for Unmetered Telecommunications. He has spoken at conferences, including the Ancestral Health Symposium and Ketofest, on the nexus of culture, technology, and semiotics. Since 2010, he has adopted a paleo-ish low-carb, high-fat lifestyle, to which he nevertheless applies a multidisciplinary scepticism. He is also the ruler of the frost giants, found by the Asgardian king, a named god of mischief, and possesses superhuman strength, speed, agility, stamina, genius-level intellect, and has mastered the art of Asgardian sorcery.
Okay, I don't know if I agree with that part.
It was interesting.
Yeah. Well, all I wanted to get was a guy. All I wanted to get was Nick MAILER for our podcast. I didn't know he had that many superpowers.
Well, he definitely goes above and beyond.
Definitely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, welcome to our 50th episode of Keto Geek. Let's have a blast. You guys enjoy the show.
Well, I got myself some ketones in my brain, and anybody with a ketone in his or her brain is a superhuman, or as they used to be called, humans. It's just that everybody, I'm not going to say subhuman because that makes me sound like a little bit of a Nazi, but everybody else is not working to their full human potential if their brain is full of glucose, are they, by definition? The brain needs a few ketones to live up to the sapien bit of the Homo sapien part of the deal. So, why? Well, I think I've explained this before elsewhere, so I'll give it a quick summary. My mother's dad died quite early of a heart attack. And so from a very young age, it's kind of been, well, what went wrong exactly with his machinery then, and how do you stop it going wrong? And as you know, and as we all know, the conventional answer is pretty close to go and do some exercise and go and be a vegan. And then you might stop the bomb from going off in your chest. But sadly, I started to see some of those threads were unraveling. I think, as you know, when you read a bit of Gary Taubes, when you see Robert Lustig, when you also understand how a lot of these narratives are built to support things other than health. They're built to support the health of certain industries. They're built to support the health of certain grain gluts. And then you look at sort of puritanical narrative about veganism and vegetarianism and avoiding rich foods and meats that go back for centuries, if not millennia. You begin to realize that it's not all that it cracked out to be. Of course, you then have to question yourself, because you then think, am I one of those nutty conspiracy theorists now? And you almost think, am I just the mirror image of a vegan cultist? And so you then have to ask yourself questions. And one of the answers to those questions is, actually, most of us are dragged into this lifestyle pretty much kicking and screaming. We don't believe it. We fight every step of the way. We've been brought up to believe that saturated fat is the devil incarnate. We believe that meat is probably going to give us cancer. And everybody is telling this. It's ringing through every article that you read in every popular science magazine. And then suddenly to wake up from that takes a lot of work. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like falling into step rhythm and saying, well, actually, I'm going to do what you're telling me to do. I eat more vegetables, but I'm going to do it even better. I'm suddenly going to turn my whole, can I use a pretentious word? Weltanschauung around, worldview. And that means that anybody who does that has those moments of falsification. You've done it, I've done it, where you think, early on in particular, can I really eat this pile of whipped cream and not feel like I'm doing myself an injury? Can I really eat this whole steak and not feel like my arteries are going to get clogged up and I'm going to get cancer? Is it really true? And you're checking yourself constantly, and you're looking and listening to all the counter arguments. And then eventually the science wins and you have to submit to it. And I think that's where most of us have gotten to. It's not that we're born into a life of carnivory and fat acceptance. That is the fat you eat rather than the hyperinsulinemia fat you've got around your belly. But you're born into this world of denial and calories in, calories out. And if you drink a Coke, you need to run 5 miles, but the Coke's fine, and all that kind of nonsense. So I think that's the key to it. Would you agree that it's because we have to fight against the prevailing narrative that kind of keeps us a bit more honest, I suppose? At least I hope it does most of the time. Sometimes we can be too keen to ignore some of the falsifications of even of our pet theories. But I hope it's rational, and there's evidence to say that we're a bit better than the tofu heads at this. What do you reckon?
I think that the keto movement and the low carb movement is a bit more on the rational side, and that goes towards, I think, a drive from a belief. I think most people want to do good. At least that's what they tell themselves, or that's how they think. But usually it's a lot more complicated than that. That's where I approach. And, let's get into something very interesting that I wanted to ask you. So, Ivor Cummins, engineer. Dave Feldman, engineer. You have a very different viewpoint on this, I would imagine, because I have something called the theory of magnifying glasses. I just made that up, I think, 6 months ago. And in that, it's like I isolate away from the problem and look at it from a perspective of someone who has a different knowledge base. Your knowledge base is grounded in philosophy. I'm pretty sure you're way more vast than just philosophy. But if you were to approach it from your viewpointer and zoom in into the problem of what's going on these days, what do you see here?
What I see is, well, it's interesting. It's philosophy, but of course philosophers make money usually by doing something else. And I make money by running a tech company where a lot of the time I do software engineering and systems engineering. So it's philosophy plus engineering. And I think that that means something. So I see it from both sides. I see, and actually, those two worlds are not as distinct as you might imagine. Remember when I was at university, I had a flatmate that was doing a computer science major, and basically, week before I got my philosophy homework, he got his computer science homework, which was all to do with predicate logic. And I said, that's all right. We did that in philosophy logic class a week before. I'll help you with that. So there was a lot of synergy with regard to logic and logical systems and inferences and deduction in engineering and computing and in all those subjects, which of course is then fed into philosophy, because of course philosophy is not simply sitting around wondering what the color of beauty is. It's about some quite rigorous systems of logic. It's looking at the basis of things like Boolean algebra. It's looking at fallacies and how to represent them in an abstract notation and that kind of thing. So from those two perspectives, what one sees is a world where people are very detail oriented. They do have their magnifying glasses, but what they're doing is they're looking at their own little pile of exquisitely crafted knowledge. And they're forgetting that that's all on top of a foundation that they forgot properly to validate. So the way I put that is, they'll kind of hand wave and say, oh, yes, well, epidemiology, causation is not implied by these studies, blah, blah, blah. But never mind, let's pretend they are. And now let's look at the exquisite mechanisms to explain why, for example, red meat gives us cancer. And they will work out like angels dancing on the head of the pin exactly what compound does what, where, and the other, forgetting that however exquisite their explanation is, if it's not explaining anything that happens in the real world, they are making up a poem or a fantasy. And so people are too easily beguiled into thinking that just because there's a great volume of nonsense upon which their whole science, for want of a better term, because not science, most of it is based, that doesn't mean that that's qualitatively justified. So, for example, we can have somebody like Walter Willett who will torture the same nurses' health study data again and again and again and use new math on it to prove more and more pieces of nonsense. But then you look back and you say, well, this is totally flawed data. It's to do with food questionnaires and all the other confounders. And you can't just use math to get rid of real world confounder problems. You cannot do that. Whatever an epidemiologist does, what they're doing is they're making their model prettier. But whether their model is pretty or not is not something the world gives a damn about. And they will never be able to get their model to take into account the total chaos, the literal chaos that a true world system that their model is supposed to represent would encapsulate. So while Walter Willett will ignore that bit, Mr. Epidemiologist will talk about how he has such wonderful mathematical tools to make his models better and then tell you that red meat's going to give you cancer. What you have to tell him is, rewind, Walter. You can't ignore that bit because, as any computer scientist says, garbage in, garbage out. And it doesn't matter how exquisitely you refine that garbage and how many times you process that garbage, it's still going to be garbage when it comes out again. And I think that's the major problem. People are very good at what they do, but they're building stuff out of imaginary phantasms, and that's the problem. And I think if you look at any dietary advice that's given today in the mainstream, that's the problem. And then of course they fall into the usual paradoxes, like they say, well, we've decided that saturated fat gives people heart disease, and therefore a diabetic who is for some reason going to be more likely to have heart disease should not eat saturated fat. That seems a logical inference, doesn't it? Saturated fat causes heart disease. Therefore, somebody who's more likely to get saturated fat shouldn't eat heart disease, shouldn't eat saturated fat. A diabetic is shown empirically to be more likely to get heart disease. Ergo, a diabetic shouldn't eat saturated fat. There you go, logic. It's beautiful, isn't it? One problem. What do they then eat? Oh, they eat carbohydrates because that's the only other form of their energy. What did you say diabetes was a problem with again? Shh, doesn't matter. We've done the syllogism. So it forces them into these weird contortions where even their own logic that looks like it's so perfectly constructed, they don't stop to question the fundamental bases and saying, well, I've worked myself into a paradox here. When a philosopher works himself into a paradox, he says, there's a major problem with my reasoning. When a dietitian works himself into a paradox, he says, I'll just label it a paradox and put it in a little drawer of curiosities and ignore the implications. The French paradox, the this paradox, the that paradox. It's used as a way of labeling something as if it's like in Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum of Strangeness or whatever, and we don't have to question it any further. We just look at it, give a little giggle, and then continue to tell diabetics to eat sugar.
Here's an interesting question, now that we're on the topic of scientists. Are we going to get the next Galileo or Einstein? Because knowledge is so abundant nowadays, it seems, at least based on my limited perspective, that it's going to be very hard to have huge breakthroughs where you're the hero with 1,000 faces. And sort of like, I think it's ingrained in our upbringing. Like whenever you're watching a Disney movie, that's what you see. So I would imagine that has future implications in how people grow up. And for a scientist, I'd imagine they want to be the champion. They want to be the one that does it all.
That may or may not happen. Every generation thinks that the last generation solved most of the problems and we're just tying up the details. It's funny, end of 19th century, I can't remember which physicist said, but basically they said physics is all done now. It's all just going to be, tidying the loose edges. And then, as you say, the quantum guys came and Einstein came. And so, just when you think you're all done and there are going to be no more great heroes, suddenly something happens. In our world of food, the people who are doing revolutionary work, Einsteinian levels of revolutionary work in a funny way, are not the scientists in Harvard. They're not Walter Willett's boys. They're people like Dave Feldman. What he has demonstrated about our view, the way our view of cholesterol is just completely incorrect or incomplete, is nutritionally as radical as what Einstein told us was wrong with Newtonian physics. The fact that it's primarily an energy distribution system, which he can prove by saying gut on fat for 3 days and you'll find your cholesterol level drops. You tell that, you could be a ringer. You could go around to all your doctors and you could say, hey, doc, I'm going to take a bet with you. If I can bring my cholesterol down like by 20% in 3 days without taking any pill, by drinking jugs of cream every day, will you give me $100? And they'll take that bet. There is no way in hell that they would believe that. So you could be rich on that little scheme. So it's people like that who are taking that myriad. You said there's a huge amount of data out there. That's both a problem, but it's also an opportunity, because with all that data, it takes a few clever guys like Dave Feldman, like Amber O'Hearn, to sift through it and create new narratives. When you do sound synthesis and you start with a white noise and you distill a beautiful signal out of it as you get rid of more and more sine waves from it until the subtractive synthesis. And that's kind of what I see these people are doing. All that data out there is this white noise. There's a potential for any signal to come out of it. And there are some artists out there, like Dave, who distill beautiful new signals out of it and take the opportunity of using that sort of subtractive synthesis to teach us completely new things. So, there will be heroes, but perhaps they will not be fated in journals, because usually a journal only fates somebody who is dull and pedestrian these days.
And this brings us to a very important point, which is, if I'm a scientist, I have my hands tied because I will be told what to do research on because that's my paycheck. For people like Dave Feldman, we're noticing that these people are not exactly termed as scientists for a specific company. They're full freelance themselves, and a lot of them are doing it as they're on their free time. But this brings us to another interesting point, is some of these scientists seem like they're way ahead of the time. And if you're a scientist, you probably cannot say, for example, let's use the carnivory movement. Like, they can't say that carnivory is a plausible solution to, let's say, some sort of an autoimmune disease. But then you have meatheals.com and certain other places where you notice substantially that people are improving their autoimmune conditions. And then you have certain clinicians who are utilizing some weird protocols and getting some results. So how do you think we can tie this all together? And I think I just poured the entire universe on you, but I like to see your opinion on this.
Well, there are different ways of answering that, but I guess the question is, when you say scientist, what do you mean? What do we mean by scientist? Is it somebody whose job is doing science with a capital S, or is it somebody who pursues their life by using the scientific method? All the greatest scientists have, at some part in their lives, been amateurs. If we talk about people like Michael Faraday or even Einstein himself, when he was working in the watch factory of as a patent clerk or whatever, they have some of their most brilliant insights while they're not working for the institutions. The institution is kind of a reward for the insights that they have. And I think that's still probably going to be the case. So let's zoom out and see what's going to happen. Well, we know what is going to happen if trajectories are not changed. We know that every health system in the world will go bankrupt. We know that male fertility, for example, and female fertility, male fertility is dropping precipitously every year. And at some point, species propagation probably won't be viable. So we know where this is going to go if there isn't an intervention. So at some point, we're going to be desperate enough for an intervention that all those kooky doctors, that you've interviewed on your podcast, we know Ted Naiman and the rest of them, all those kooky, crazy doctors, the dangerous Gary Fetkes, the mad and bad Tim Noakes of this world, are suddenly going to be grabbed on as if they're sort of life rafts in a turbulent ocean. And they're going to say, okay, well, we just said that what you were talking was nonsense and it was anecdotes and it was this and that. But we give up. We've tried everything else, and nothing else works. And then it will have been their idea all the time. So that's what happens when you look at the paradigm shift. The old order, some of them die out, and the ones who don't die out, they kind of say, well, actually, you know what? We knew that meat was our primary sustaining food at all times. And we've always worked with paleontologists. We were just a bit worried, a few details which we sorted out, but actually we were right all the time. And it's amazing when you look back at the geographers. They fought against the notion of plate tectonics for decades. And they said that anybody who believes in plate tectonics is an idiot and a kook. How can you say continents are floating on? No, you mad people. And now, of course, we always believed in plate tectonics. Of course we did. And you speak to any geographer today, and he won't say, my whole field was ignoring and denying the science for years and years and years and had to be dragged kicking and screaming by a few mavericks into what we believe today. No, I'll say, we just progressed gently, progressed in the passive tense. We just floated like those continents into a new understanding. And I think if we go forward 30 years, we always knew that we shouldn't take statins, really. It was a little blip, but we knew we shouldn't. We always knew that, good quality, stable fats were good for us. We knew that calories were not the whole story. And you're already beginning to see these. There's some little articles coming out saying, well, it's the quality of the calories. And then other articles coming out saying, well, maybe not all fats are that bad. And then other articles coming out and saying, well, maybe if the beef is grass-fed and is sustained, grudging kind of acceptance. And then maybe cholesterol in eggs isn't that much of a problem. The way they put it, they say, the cholesterol, I think the USDA said, the cholesterol in eggs is no longer a nutrient of concern. Like it's got out of prison. It served its time. Not that they made a terrible mistake. The egg has learned its lesson, and they've let it out of prison. It's a good boy now because of the lessons they've taught it. So you see, it's never their fault. It's never them learning stuff. It's the whole world's just coming around to their way of thinking in this weird plastic way. So that's what I think will happen. And I think anybody who needs the credit will take the credit, and anybody who doesn't feel that they need the credit and just wants fewer people to have their legs chopped off because of hyperinsulinemia will be happy that others can enjoy the credit for that nevertheless.
All right, I'm going to use a Star Wars analogy. How do we know these people aren't rebels just looking for trouble? And how do you figure out, okay, these guys are on the right side and I should listen to them and follow them? What's your method of distillation here?
Well, I think I probably have mentioned this at every conference I've talked at and every podcast I've been on and probably every article I've written. And that is, there was in the 1930s a group of philosophers called the logical positivists. And they wanted to introduce the scientific method into the realm of philosophy and the realm of understanding the whole world and the realm of discussing things and even history and things like that. And they said, we've got to stop telling ourselves stories which sound good but have no meaning. We've got to find out how to properly understand the way the world works. And they said, well, firstly, we're empiricists. You can't just deduce something. Like if I say, I can deduce that a triangle has 3 sides. Well, no, you've just given another name for a triangle. You've gone round in circles because that's the definition of a triangle. You're chasing your tail. Any new knowledge is inductive. Inductive knowledge means you're using your senses. Think of it. Imagine you could not see, you could not hear, you could not feel. You were a brain in a vat that had no external sense input. What would you know? Descartes says you would know that you existed because you could think. Well, maybe. I don't know. What does that even mean? So everything else, you agree, comes from your senses. So what the logical positivists said was we'll be empirical, and we will say that the meaning of a statement, anything that's said, is the method of its verification. So these guys you mentioned, these rebels, they'll say, meat heals. That's a statement. And you say, okay, well, what's the method of that verification? Well, then they'll say, well, that means that if you eat meat for 30 days, you will see these particular biomarkers improve. You will see your HDL will go up. You'll see your fasting triglycerides will come down. Your blood pressure will drop, blah, blah, blah. You're suddenly then making empirical statements that you can validate and then you can falsify. Whereas if somebody says God is love, the meaning of a statement is a method of its verification. Well, I don't know how I can verify that. So at that point, they say that's just a metaphysical statement. It's like poetry. It's something that it's almost like a mantra. You can enjoy it, but you're not going to get any useful data out of it. And so you separate things out from things that I can validate and verify versus things that are just poetry or metaphysical nonsense, as they called them. Now, of course, the verifications creed came under its own problem because, of course, that statement itself, the meaning of a statement is the method of its verification. Well, that's a statement. How do I verify that statement? You see, it gets a bit recursive. So they kind of started chasing their own tails. So this guy, Karl Popper, comes along and says, you could verify everything in the world, and there might be still one exception that screws your theory. And that's where the phrase black swan came from. So he says, if I say all swans are white, well, what have I got to do? I've got to look and find every single swan that ever existed and find out whether it's white or not. And then I'll have verified, I'll have validated my statement. Well, that's a tough gig to find every swan that's ever existed or ever will exist. However, it's very easy to falsify. I can know whether I'm wrong about that because, of course, I just have to find one black swan on a pond. And I know then and there that that theory that all swans are white is false. I falsified that statement. And so falsification is very important. It's crucial. And that's what every good scientist will do these days. They know that they cannot find every possible case that they can validate their theory because they're not God. So what they will do is they will look for a way to falsify the theory. Every day, a good scientist should get up and find out, how can I prove myself wrong today? And if they then go to sleep and find out that they haven't proved themselves wrong, they can feel a little bit more happy with the solidity of their theory. So here's a good example of this, all right? Ivor Cummins talks about this. Now, you know the Kitavans, don't you? Everybody who loves carbs talks about the Kitavans because Kitavans have a relatively high carb diet, and yet they don't have heart disease. And they don't have diabetes, and they don't tend to have cancer and those kinds of things. So they say, aha, you see, you can have carbs and be healthy. Now, there are lots of arguments about why that is. They don't spend their time eating vegetable oils. They spend some of their time doing fasting. They also eat a lot of coconuts and have coconut oil. Interesting. So, in a sense, you could say they might be a problem for meatheads in that they prove there is an alternative strategy. Of course, a perspicacious meathead would say, well, we never said there wasn't an alternative strategy. It's just that I think eating steaks is an easier way of doing it. But here's something else that they do. So people went to the Kitavans island and they said, let's look at their blood. It must be amazing. It's going to be so low cholesterol because, they don't get heart disease. They eat all these plants and all those kinds of things. They had the same ApoB status as the average American male eating the standard American diet, or worse. In other words, their blood was full of LDL, full of LDLP, and yet they weren't getting heart disease. So anybody who hears that knows right away that the statement LDL cholesterol independently causes heart disease has been falsified. That's it. That theory is gone. Finished. It's done. The dishonest scientists, the Walter Willits of these worlds, and the people who sell statins will ignore that. They'll say, that's just the Kitavans. That's just one study. Look at the 500,000 people we looked at in this crappy epidemiology study where we gave them a statin. They were 0.001% more like blah, 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 blah. No. Shh. Your theory has been falsified. End of story. Another example, people with familial hypercholesterolemia. They love talking about those people because they're people who seem to have higher blood cholesterol and seem to die more prevalently of heart attacks and things like that. Aha, they say. Cholesterol heart attacks proves it. Here's the problem. People with familial hypercholesterolemia with very high LDL and people with familial hypercholesterolemia with less LDL don't have different rates of heart disease. They have the same rates of heart disease. In other words, those people say, the more LDL you have, the more heart disease. It's simple. It's a line. There's the graph. Good night. Take your statin. No. You're falsified by your own special people you use constantly to tell us. And that's what I love about this. I like taking people that they are using as examples to prove their point to then prove my point. So they say, look at the Kitavans. And I say, yeah, let's look at the Kitavans. Let's look at them differently. Look at the familial hypercholesterolemiacs. Yeah, let's look at them. However, let's look at them differently. I don't want to use them to validate any of my hypotheses. I want to use them to falsify somebody else's. And that's what's quite useful. So, I'm quite consistent about that. So, for example, when the Pure study happened last year, and everybody was really excited because it seemed to show that people who eat more carbs are more likely to die early and more associated with early mortality and all that kind of thing. It was epidemiology again. So I said, no, you can't prove that. It's not fair to grab on this one just because they're playing for our team, so to speak. You can't do that. However, what I can say is that it did measure average saturated fat intake and found that there was no correlation with mortality. So while I can't say it proves that carbs do kill people, I can say that it does suggest very strongly that eating a lot of fat, saturated fat, doesn't. I get to say that, but I don't get to say the positive. So you can see that Popper with his falsification is a useful tool. So how do we know, getting back to which of these rebels are causing trouble and which ones are the ones to follow? See whether they're prepared to try their darndest hardest to falsify their theory, and see if they're hostile towards you if you try to falsify their theory. If they welcome you as a brother, they're worth following. If they scorn you and block you, they weren't worth following in the first place.
You have a very poetic way of saying things. Just want to say that out there.
Thank you.
So we were talking about this bottom-up approach, and you went into this crazy mode of biochemistry at Ketofest this year. And I think let's tie it in here where you talk about the mevalonate pathway, and you actually figured out the biological steps that were necessary, why this issue with LDL and lowering LDL is not the focus, or what your take on it is. And so here's my question. What's up with that? What's up with cholesterol?
Well, there were two reasons to do that talk, really. The first reason was I myself thought if I'm going to be talking about these statins and things to every relative that we have eventually asks us saying, oh, I know somebody, or my uncle did this, or my aunt was told by his doctor to take a statin or whatever. And I need to know how these damn things work and what they do. Because I had a relative who basically said something like, well, I was told by my doctor that they just kind of clean out the arteries like drain cleaner. You know, they scar nice and clean. And I actually used that in an early slide of my talk when I said this is what most people think. It literally is what I've heard. And I thought, I really don't like it when bad metaphors come into play and beguile people when it's not the truth. So I want to find out what these things actually do. Before for example, my 92-year-old grandmother at the time was told to take one because she had high cholesterol. And I said, no, don't, because none of the data shows that certainly an old woman should lower her cholesterol. It's a dangerous thing to actually do. So I said, the information is out there, whether it's on Wikipedia, whether it's YouTube university lecturers, as you said, all the information's out there. And it's a bit like my day job in technology with open source. When you've got open source software, you can always get to the root of a problem because you can read the source code, you can read the blueprints. It's up to you how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. Nobody else is going to stop you. It's only your own time and laziness that's going to prevent you from doing it. So I thought, screw this. These guys have invited me to talk all the way in New London, Connecticut. So I've got time to prepare. And I'm damn well not going to be lazy because, you know, Richard and Carl are very nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find out from the very start of the process to your body making cholesterol, molecule by molecule. What's going on? What does it use? How does it do it? What does it transform into? How is it regulated? And then I'm going to find out what happens if you throw a statin into the mix. So first thing I had to do is I had to teach myself how to use PowerPoint to do animations because I'd never done the damn things. I'd always done presentations as these static PDFs. So, you know, that was more difficult than the Mevalonate pathway, I can tell you that much. And so I can say anybody out there who's scared about learning about biochemistry, learning how to animate biochemistry is far more difficult than the biochemistry itself. So I then said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take every step because I watched my daughter and her niece playing with Lego bricks. You know, they will break them apart and put them together again and build new things and then take that down and then use this widget to pull them around. People are very good at, you know, seeing components put together, pulled apart, pushed back together again, reorganized. And that's all that chemistry is. That's it. Chemistry is a bunch of very, very, very long chains of Lego bricks doing all sorts of interesting things. So I thought, if you kind of put a name to a face, it always makes something more meaningful, doesn't it? And so I said, let's put a name, let's put a face to these weird names of these compounds that we hear in chemical textbooks sometime. Let's actually see what happens when they fly together. Let's take those bits of food and let's see what happens when the acetyl groups join together. And forcing myself to animate them did something else interesting. You read a lot of these diagrams and you read a lot of these textbooks, they kind of show there's the left-hand side of the equation and there's the right-hand side of the chemical equation. And they don't show how they all joined up together, which Lego brick joined to where, you know. And so, but if you're going to animate it, you damn well have to show it because, you know, you can't go click, click, oh, look, magic. And so I suppose you put a puff of smoke, saying, you know, there you go. But if you're going to be honest, and there was one bit where it produced HMG, which is the compound in this where you've got two groups and then one group joining together. I said, well, where does that bond go? And it took me like 2 days just to find out where that happened. And I found some really obscure long diagram in a book somewhere that I kind of eventually worked out. And then I animated it. And it's like, and then you see in the thing, it's kind of, you see the bond kicking its leg up, going like that, and then spreading out again. This kind of weird kind of Kama Sutra action that goes on with the threesome. And that was my favorite slide because I cracked it, something that had been annoying me. I said, how the hell do these things join up? And then it worked. And then progressed on there. And then eventually you make squalene, which is this sharp liver oil that then cyclizes into lanosterol, which eventually becomes cholesterol, which is, of course, a steroid. So our body loves roiding ourselves. Why did I do this? Firstly, I think it's really important to see how damn hard our body works to make cholesterol. It's got factories in every cell that have dozens of one-use enzymes whose sole job is to help nudge these chemicals into becoming cholesterol and all the other things down the pathway. And that's another point. This factory doesn't just produce cholesterol. It produces dozens and dozens of compounds that every cell uses for so many things to do with structure, to do with making testosterone. And one of the diagrams I showed, I said, well, here's cholesterol. And then we moved one or two bits off the cholesterol molecule and I go, bang, it's now testosterone. If you blinked, it looks almost identical. One or two bits move off, bang, it's now estrogen. They look almost identical. Bang, it's vitamin D. All these steroids and sterols that our factory makes that are very similar and do radically important things. And then I say, what happens if you throw a spanner in the works of the factory and the factory closes down, which is what a statin does. And so then we looked and said, well, how were statins formed? They were formed a bit like antibiotics. We looked at how the funguses fought with each other and fought with bacteria and produced chemical warfare to destroy their enemies. And you're talking about Star Wars. It is a bit like the tiny little thing that it throws in and then blows up the whole thing. So, and that's kind of what they do. And they're very clever. And there's one guy called Endo found out how it does that. And the important thing about statins as well is they think it clears out your arteries. No, what it does is it panics your cell into pulling more and more LDL out of the blood because its internal factory has been shut down, basically. So the cholesterol isn't disappearing. It's not going away. It's not being dissolved. It's being shoved, packed into the cell as the cell desperately tries to get, because of course the cell's hardwired to rebuild its factories and to grab more cholesterol from the blood at the same time. So, but its factories keep getting bombed by the statin. So all it's doing is getting more and more cholesterol inside the cells, which are packed into these cells, which start crystallizing in the cells and actually damaging the inside of the cells. But as I said in the talk, the doctor doesn't stick a pin into your cell and say, oh my God, your cell's full of cholesterol. Your doctor sticks a pin into your bloodstream and says, oh, the cholesterol's down. You're very happy. In other words, what you measure is where you gain your comfort from. And if you don't bother measuring the other stuff, you don't see most of the story. So that was the point of doing quite a complex narrative and showing, okay, well, you don't have to remember all these weird names, but I'll also tell you why they are called those weird names. I really went into the etymology, like there were various complex names. I showed how chemistry nomenclature works. It's not that complicated. It's just when they've got numbers in, it's just telling you which carbon atom it's attached to. Don't worry about it. So it helps you then draw the diagram and that kind of stuff. So that was the kind of the detailed reason why I did it. But the more general reason was, let's take 40 minutes of our time. Let's start 40 minutes not knowing about a complex biochemical pathway. And 40 minutes later, let's be au fait and not scared of what 3-hydroxy-3-methylglutaryl coenzyme A reductase inhibitor means and what its implication is. Getting from there to there in 40 minutes with pictures. And if I could do that, I said to myself, that means that others can do that as well. And it means that we are no longer in a state where we have to defer to experts. We can all grab little bits of knowledge and put it in our stew pot. We can become our own experts for one another. We can take time off to learn about this little bit. Somebody out there could learn about the Krebs cycle. Somebody else out there can learn, if you're talking about ketosis, learn about how our bodies produce ketones. Find out why beta-hydroxybutyrate isn't actually a ketone at all, which is the funniest part of, the whole point of ketosis is to produce something that basically isn't a ketone, and things like that. And then you will start putting things together because you said, okay, maybe an individual hero isn't going to crack it anymore with this amount of information out there. And we know the experts, those people who are at the top of drugs companies in their labs who are there to create patents and pretty much nothing else, are not going to give us that information. And the people who work for Monsanto and the people who work for the USDA and the people who work for the diabetics charities who are funded by Kellogg's, are not going to give us this information. They're going to tell us, in fact, that this information is far too complex for us mere mortals to understand. And I am basically doing a cri de coeur and saying, no, screw you. It's just Lego. We all have basically the same brains. And if we are no longer made terrified of long names and long mechanisms, we can then start to understand these things. And the people I spoke to at the end said, yeah, it was complex, and I didn't follow all of it. But by the end of it, I had a pretty damn good picture about what was going on. And I said, good, because you now know more than your GP, than your average family doctor does about how cholesterol works and how statins break the mevalonate pathway. And yet they are the ones who are subscribing statins, and you're not. So give yourself a clap. And I thought, if we can all become citizen understanders of science, just these little bits, and we stop listening for apologies or apologizing for complexity, and instead we say, revel in the complexity. The complexity is fun because you digest it, and then it's no longer complex. Think about the average American trying to understand the rules of cricket. Think about the average Brit trying to understand the rules of American football. We all find it ridiculously, ludicrously complex because we're not particularly interested in it. However, those people who are imbued in those sports don't think it's complex because they have an interest to understand it. For them, it's easy. Now, look at the average Brit who understands what the offside rule is in soccer, as you'd call it, trying to explain it to somebody. There are massively complex things. There are people who, talk about baseball and cricket, the stats, the statistics that people go into. It's unbelievable. You'd give an epidemiologist a run for their money. And yet for them, because it's their interest, suddenly they're not scared of the detail anymore. So what I'm interested in is those detail that we've been told we need to be scared of. I'm going to be knocking on that details door and saying, okay, you're trying to hide something from me. I want to explain it to myself. And I know I've explained to myself when I can explain to somebody else. So if we give ourselves a challenge of learning something complex to the degree where we know it well enough that we are satisfied we can explain to someone else, then I think we'll be getting somewhere. And that's a way of cutting through that huge amount of data and not relying on one scientist to do it all for us. Finally, what sums it up is the thing that frustrates me most about things like Facebook is you visit a Facebook page, even a carnivore group or a keto group or something, and somebody, and you'll see this every day, probably happens on your groups as well, they'll post the latest meat kills link or the latest saturated fat makes you explode article or the latest Walter Willett crap. And they'll post a link from USA Today or whatever. And they'll post it there. And what they'll say under that link is thoughts? ? And that's all they'll say. And that pisses me off no end, because what they are doing is they're outsourcing their thinking to somebody else on a Facebook group. In other words, they're not saying, I've read through it, I can see these are the problems that concern me, I did some research myself and found out that actually that thing that they said really wasn't true, but that thing that they said, I'm still not sure about. Can you give me any more evidence? No, they're just saying, help, I'm a scared little bunny rabbit I thought I was going to eat some meat, and now this USA Today thing's come out, and I need to outsource my thoughts to somebody else. I find that debilitating, and I think we need to get out of that mindset. We need to say, I have thoughts. What do you think of them? Rather than thoughts, and then be like a deer in the headlights waiting for you to tell them to calm them down. Calm down, you can eat meat again, dear, until the next scary headline comes out, at which point you'll be like a deer in the headlight again. Think about the number of our friends who every time these things come out, they say, oh, you see, they were right. You shouldn't eat X, Y, and Z. You see, keto is dangerous. You see, fat will do X, Y, and Z. And you sort of say, this is the 7th time somebody's tried to torture that data to say it. Go and look at the problems of epidemiology and then come back to me and we'll chat. So I have all the time in the world to explain complex things to myself and to others, but not when that person clearly is just there to get pre-digested pap for the rest of their life and to be a deer in the headlights when any small thing that disrupts their shallow thinking comes into play.
It's interesting because it's kind of like the sheep in the herd sort of mentality, where you're not actually adding value, but you're looking for that herder and waiting for guidance from them. And in Facebook, I've noticed that it's quite a brain drain. I avoid these kind of topics because
I avoid them now as well. Well done. Yeah. It's terrible.
It's so annoying. And if I have to respond to something, we'll usually do a live stream, take notes of certain topics that are recurring. We'll cover it on the podcast and that kind of stuff. We'll make a wider impact. But I think people really need to start adding value to others' lives. Every day someone wakes up and says, how can I add value to this world? And what can I think about today? Okay, this is a problem. I have Google. I have research papers. In fact, there are interesting ways to go beyond the abstract now. So that's the big problem here right now. So why do people gravitate towards this sort of mentality? I mean, I think we've done that since the dawn of time now.
Yeah.
And is this out of laziness? Is this out of escapism? Is it just deferring to an authority? What's going on?
It's sort of deferring to authority, and I suppose evolutionarily it does make sense because, people wanted to follow those who appeared to have successful strategies, because those people who had successful strategies presumably had to risk certain things to attain that knowledge, had to experiment, had to find out the best way to fight that saber-toothed tiger to kill it. And so you gravitate towards those people who have those success, and you start saying, well, my offspring are more likely to survive if I basically mimic what that person does, and I'm a kind of free rider on that knowledge because I didn't have to take the risks to get it. And that's rational, that's fine, and that will work a lot of the time. The problem is in today's environment, we don't kind of have that luxury. As you said, the information landscape is too variegated. There's too much. It's too easy to be confused by the white noise and just submit to the person who has the strongest signal within that white noise. I think that's a problem. Whereas what you should be doing is listening hard for all the signals that you can find and disentangling them, because otherwise you will just end up being swayed from hither to post. One day to another, you'll start eating meat tentatively. Then you'll suddenly be scared again because somebody in USA Today says that's going to kill you. Then you'll suddenly realize, oh, but I'm not getting enough iron, so maybe I should start again. And you'll have no basis for your beliefs, no mechanistic understanding, no appreciation of what the limits of knowledge actually are. And that's also important to understand. So realize that for a lot of these things, you are going to have to go it alone to a degree, and you're going to have to make judgments that may be risky. You are going to have to be the herder because there isn't actually anybody who knows how to take the herd across that particular ravine. Anybody who's had any experience in any part of medicine, a specific part of medicine. So if you have somebody in your family suffers from a very specific disease, or even frankly, somebody in your family gives birth, you realize that there are these tiny, tiny islands of knowledge in medicine. And then there's these vast pools of darkness where everybody just assumes things. What can you give as an effective painkiller to somebody who's in labor who doesn't want an epidural? That research kind of stopped in the 1920s and 30s because it became unethical just to keep injecting mothers with different things and seeing what worked best and didn't hurt the baby. So actually, the answer is, we're not really sure. So we kind of just give them heroin or diamorphine, as it's called, or various other things in the UK, or laughing gas. And that's kind of where it stopped. You look at many other diseases and you drill down, you find out, well, there are people who are shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, I guess you could try X, but the data is uncertain, and we don't really know what's going to help. But we kind of think X, Y, and Z. So you look online and you read the research papers for X, Y, and Z, and you find it's highly inconclusive and was based on a particular research paper that was paid for by a pharmaceutical company. So there is a great kind of pattern of sureness out there. The average doctor has a certain bravado in presentation, saying this is the diagnosis of X, Y, and Z. No, he really doesn't know what he's doing most of the time, and he's desperately trying to remember which pill to give for which ailment, which is caused by the pill that he gave for another ailment. When you get a doctor drunk, they tell you how little they actually know. When the God complex goes away. And I think that that's very important to realize as well, because if you just follow those experts, it may be that they just make a good show of killing a saber-toothed tiger, but when it comes down to it, you'll be mauled, and so will he. And I think that's the problem. We all have to realize that there are tigers out there that people are kind of ignoring in a weird way. People are ignoring it. The precipitous decline in fertility is weird because it's kind of, people know it's happening, that women are getting PCOS at unbelievable rates, that people are having to do artificial insemination at ridiculous rates, and it's not even being as successful as it once was in certain circumstances. The average sperm count is dropping precipitously across the globe. And you think, wow, imagine this were happening to any other species but ours. Imagine that you said, oh my goodness, all these animals are suddenly not being fertile anymore. You think, my God, that animal is heading towards extinction. Something massive is going wrong. Whereas with us, it's kind of, well, I guess we should just eat less and exercise more. And I don't know, maybe it'll be all right. And anyway, have your McDonald's and heart healthy whole grains and do some exercise. And maybe it's because of the video games, eh? Facile things for these major, huge species-changing problems. The fact that kids get what used to be called adult-onset diabetes. Oh, well, yeah, I guess something changed in the last 20 years. But I guess it's those video games again. Or, yeah, they're not walking to school anymore. That's why kids are getting diabetes. And the same facile answers come out. Oh, well, yeah, they just need to do some more exercise, or portion size needs to be smaller, or suddenly kids have become greedier than they ever were for the last 2 million years, the last 20 years, or whatever. It's these bizarre answers given to epoch-changing problems that make us realize that the experts don't know what the hell is going on, and also have no strategy for really finding out. And that's why you then have to use people like Gary Taubes, people like Amber O'Hearn, people like Dave Feldman, people who at least have interesting new hypotheses, which you can then try to falsify. But at least they're taking you down a path that might lead you away from the saber-toothed tiger, whereas we know that mainstream advice guarantees you will be mauled by the saber-toothed tiger. What do I mean by that? What does the average diabetologist say about diabetes? It's an inevitably progressive disease. So the average diabetologist guarantees that one day, if you follow their advice, you will be mauled by the saber-toothed tiger. It might just take a few years longer for him finally to ravage you. Whereas people like Gary Taubes, people like Gary Fatke, people like Verta Health, people like IDM are saying, no, I actually have a strategy to get you away from that damn saber-toothed tiger of diabetes. It's not necessarily progressive. Now, you can say I'm highly suspicious of that. You can say that I'm highly skeptical of that, but at least you've got something to falsify. Whereas with the diabetologist, they're saying, eat your heart healthy whole grains, live a miserable life, and die pretty soon anyway. Well, I've not got much to work with there, do I? And so that's, I think, why it's in your interests now not to follow the herder, because the herder isn't interested in your eventual well-being. Your herder is just wondering when you're going to be slaughtered.
What's interesting here is, one point is, a lot of implications, health implications, take time to develop. And the problem I'm noticing is we have normalized those. It's considered part of the culture if you are on 10 pills. It's normal now. I mean, that's a huge problem.
It's normal to be on 10 pills. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's normal to get diabetes. It's normal to be on 10 pills. It's normal that you basically start getting arthritis at 50. You notice that people are getting creaks in their joints. Oh, I got inflammation here. My hand has got this, that. I guess it's the typing, you know.
Yeah, and I think once I don't quote me on this, but there's this article that I once read that even in the fitness industry, it's not actually going up as far as lifespan is concerned. Maybe your quality of life is improving, but lifespan I don't think has improved. I will try to find a link and post it into the description as well, including your presentation as well.
Sure.
But yeah, so that is one of the concerns that I have here. And so the question here would be, is it just human nature? Do we just want to be that way? Because here's a bit of a problem. If you notice all these unhealthy foods that are out there, I mean, if you look at Eat Less, Move More, it's like, oh, duh, it makes sense, right? But once you go out there, you notice everything is telling you to eat more. Like that celebrity who's on the TV. I think I mentioned a little bit on the Alex Leaf podcast that person who's jacked to the gills, got these ripped abs going on over there, and they're consuming the most unhealthiest foods. And we're associating something that's really negative or potentially negative, let's take it potentially negative, and taking a positive icon and putting it right next to them. Are we is this part of our human nature to just pursue this sort of pleasure or hedonic eating, or what's going on? How do you make sense out of this chaotic environment?
Eating should be hedonic. Evolution would have been a damn idiot if we hadn't derived a huge amount of pleasure from eating, or indeed a huge amount of pleasure from reproducing. Any evolutionary system that made reproducing and eating a pain in the backside, literally or figuratively, without any concomitant pleasures, would fail. So obviously eating should be a pleasure, but that's eating to satiation. Satiating yourself, perhaps more accurately, should be a pleasure, whatever the appetite is. So, and there's an analogy I use frequently. When you are very thirsty, the idea of drinking a glass of water is heaven. There is no better sensation that you can think of than getting that cool glass of ice water. But once you've slaked your thirst, that ice water is no longer hedonic. Indeed, at some point, it becomes positively painful. You know, you drink and try and drink another jug of water after you've slaked yourself. Now, chug down a jug of water, then chug down another. What's going to happen? It's not hedonic anymore. It becomes a pain, and then it becomes literally painful, and then eventually you would throw up, and eventually you would drown yourself. So you wouldn't do it. I mean, it's not something you could do. Your body is very good at regulating your hedonic response to water, as it should be, because if you drink too much water, as I've said so many times, you become hyponatremic, and you can go into a coma. And there are some athletes that, you know, habitually will drink a bit too much water and will have these problems because they don't have enough salt. But usually, the average person trusts their thirst. They drink when they're thirsty. They have pleasure from drinking when they're thirsty. They stop drinking when they're not. And then, of course, anybody who doesn't do that, let's say there is somebody who drinks habitually, just drinks and drinks and drinks water. You say, oh dear, do you have rabies? Do you have type 2 diabetes that you're constantly drinking and not getting, have you taken too much E? And it's just habitual, you know? What we don't say is, ooh, you're a bit greedy with the drink. You're a bit too hedonic with the water there, mate. You know, drink a little less, why don't you? Show some willpower. You know, if you're thirsty, just go for a run and stop drinking water for God's sake. That sounds a little bit crazy. Nobody in their right minds would say that. They say, if you're thirsty, drink some water. I'm not going to stop you. But then, of course, food comes along and suddenly the moral police come out. So we trust this evolved hormonal hedonic response with one group of atoms we put in our body, H2O molecules in particular. But we don't trust the hedonic response for other groups of atoms, the food that becomes our nutrition. Suddenly, then it becomes a moral thing. It becomes we can't control ourselves, and we can't do this, and we're being greedy, or we're eating for comfort, or we're blah, 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 blah. No, that's one way of looking at it, in the same way that there are people who drink too much water because of psychological problems. But most of the time, if they are drinking too much water, it's because they have something like rabies, or they've got a problem with their brain, which means that they're not detecting the amount of fluids they have in their body. And you say that's a problem, that's an illness which we need to deal with. Whereas somebody eats too much, they say, well, just eat less. Or somebody eats a lot of food and they say, yeah, it's because the food has this platonic, like Stefan Guillenet, I don't know, I think you interviewed him, where he says, oh yeah, well, it's the food reward hypothesis. The food is just too rewarding, dear. Well, no, because there is no such thing as food reward. There is absolutely no such thing as food reward. It is the reward that your brain gives you at that moment for taking that food in, which is a very different circumstance. Same way that there is no such thing as water reward. It's the reward that your brain will give you if you drink water when you are damn thirsty. Similarly, think of the food that is the most rewarding food in the world. Think of those amazing potato chips that have been created in the lab to have the bliss point and all that crap. And then give yourself gastric flu, where your stomach is heaving and every orifice in your body is spurting everything it might. Then think about eating all those potato chips. There will be, trust me, because I've thought of this when I've had a bit of a dicky tummy, as they say. That most rewarding of foods is no longer rewarding. What's happened to the little ghost that was inside the food that was supposed to be the platonic reward? How did it go away? What happened is there are hormones in my body that are saying, that's no longer rewarding. Don't eat that. So then the question is not, oh, food is rewarding. Oh, we're too lazy. It's what's happened to our hunger signals such that we can't trust them in the same way we can trust our thirst for water signals. And then we have an interesting conversation. Now we suddenly are on the right basis for the conversation. And that's the sort of thing that Gary Taubes talks about and all those kinds of things. You take it out of the psychologist's lab, except for a very few cases, and you bring it back into the endocrinologist's lab, and then we can have a lovely chat about things. We can start talking about leptin. We can start talking about insulin. We can start talking about the various other ghrelin and other signaling hormones that are in the body. We can talk about all those sorts of things, because it's all to do with our brain. When we're a dead body, guess what? Food isn't rewarding. There's a clue there. Yeah. The fact that food is not rewarding to a dead body is a clue that it's mediated by the brain and by the hormones that slosh around that brain. And when you realize that deep down, as with everything else, you get into a hot bath. It feels too hot. Then it feels okay because you get used to it. You go into a dark room. You can't see anything. Suddenly your eyes adjust and you can see the shapes of everything in that room because your pupils have expanded. You go into these homeostatic states all the time. It's not that the world is suddenly changing around you. It's that your body is carefully, moment from moment, adapting to the world it finds itself. And if we have these items that are evolutionarily weird, that we haven't had 2 million years to reach those homeostatic mechanisms, guess what happens? The thermostat goes crazy, everything goes mad, and we fall apart. That would be the hypothesis, and that hypothesis is playing out very easily. Vegetable fats, you've talked to a lot of people about those. Those are things that are too ignored in our field. Even though we're starting to talk about them, they're possibly a bigger problem even than the carbs, than the starchy carbs. Somebody who lived on some sweet potatoes and never ate an omega-6 fat, would they have a problem? I don't know. Between you and me, I don't know. Plenty of people don't seem to. Would they eventually have a problem? I don't know. That's something waiting to be falsified. We'll see. I wrote a very big blog post called My Unsurance Policy. skimmed.cream.org/unsurance, like insurance with a U. And I had like thousands and thousands of words of all the things in nutrition that I'm unsure about, where either because the science doesn't have the answer yet, or I haven't found the answer, or I don't know yet, and I'm still digging through the complexities. And I think it's important that we all have our insurance policies, those things where we kind of distill out what do we know and what don't we know. And more importantly, what don't we know? That's what keeps us honest, because, that's one of the things I'm unsure about. I don't know why, we made fun of the Kitavans earlier on, and I know about insulin, and I know what people lazily call processed carbs seems to do to insulin signaling. The full mechanism of whether that's enough to derange you without, say, the vegetable fats and the omega-6 oils, I don't know. I kind of think so, but then again, there are plenty of people that seem to eat white rice and don't have a problem. And there was Kempner in his white rice diet, and Denise Minger wrote about something called carbosis, which is like the mirror image of ketosis for people that eat high carb and eat almost no fat. So there are really weird and interesting things waiting in the fringes of falsification, which are really fun to investigate. But I can tell you that spending your life eating donuts and drinking Coke is going to lead you to one destination if you're the average person. I think we can at least be safe about saying that without much falsification. Of course, there's always somebody who says, but my grandfather lived till 90 smoking 50 cigarettes a day. Yeah, okay, fine, whatever.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I don't quite buy anymore into the whole hyper palatable term anymore. No. Because one of the things, an easy, simple experiment is go to a turkey dinner. You're going to have a hell of a time. But the next few days, the last thing you want to eat is turkey. So another thing here is, and I think I had a conversation with Gabor as well about this, that it seems like a bad signaling problem going on over here. It's kind of like, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this, it's sort of like how you have a software and you're feeding in some terrible inputs and you're getting some bad outputs and errors and bugs. And that doesn't seem to be working out too well. By the way, this was what I was thinking in the shower today as well. So that's where go ahead.
I think you're right, but it's worse than that. It's worse than that, because you've got this software that's been running for 2 million years, and there's an input, and for 2 million years, that input has been an integer. It's been a number, all right? A positive integer, 0, 1, 2, 3, 5 million, whatever, and it's processed that. And because that's the only input that we've ever got, the programmer, i.e. evolution, hasn't bothered to do range checking. So it just assumes it's going to be an integer. Then suddenly, 30 years ago, people start typing negative numbers and think decimal points in them for the first time in 2 million years. And the body is not saying, error, please type that number again, or I'm going to round that up or round that down the way that I want to do. What it's doing is it's running it through the processing cycle as if it were an integer. And all sorts of weird things are happening that are unprecedented because it's a boundary error that is not being checked for. Now, eventually, the programmer will notice and that programmer in this case is evolution. If it's allowed to continue running like this, and if we hadn't thrown a spanner in the works with our clever forebrains that basically keep people alive to reproductive age, even when these programming problems are happening, then eventually the computer will be able to deal with minus numbers and decimal points. The subroutine will have a range check added to it, and we'll say, okay, actually it needs to be rounded up. But that takes millions of years to write those programs, not 30 years. And that's where we are at the moment. So that's a very, very good analogy. We have software that was written over 2 million years. It expected certain inputs. And it's not that the inputs are necessarily junk. I can quite foresee that a human mechanism could be created that would do very well on polyunsaturated fatty acids and donuts. We could create such a machine very efficiently with those inputs if we wanted to. It's just that we don't have the time to do it. We can't engineer that within a couple of generations unless we get something really Star Trek coming down the line. That's the problem, really. We know it's happened before. For example, that there was a major crisis in life on Earth. We're introducing poisons into our body now, like sugar, too much sugar, and starchy carbs, and then throwing on the vegetables. Those are poisons. There was one time on Earth where a major poison was infesting all of life, and most of life died. Do you know what that poison was?
I know what it is.
Oxygen.
Exactly.
You know, and it took a damn long time for these tiny little organisms to say, okay, God, what are we going to do with this poison? I know. Let's treat it like a feature, not a bug. What can we do? Hi, mitochondria, do you want to move in? Let's do a deal. Right, let's do it. Now, maybe there'll be the mitochondria of the chip factory, of the donut factory that will really process all this crap really well for us. I don't think we have the patience to wait another 2 million years to see that happen. Do you?
Yeah, and you know,
I don't think. Our species won't last. Our species won't last to see it. It'll be some other weird little rodent thing that can only live on Krispy Kremes or something.
And you know what? This is where, whenever I go into our processing system, or we're like how to make our food products, I mean, we're always now looking at these biochemical pathways, if we can understand them, or methodologies. So how I'm thinking about food processing now is, okay, now we have this long stretch of road, all the way from the mouth to your digestive system, the bottom of it, and it's connected to your brain. You have a lot of these check marks all the way up and down, left and right, everywhere. And if you start skipping those check marks, your body gets freaked out. So that's how I'm starting to think about it. And when you look at the food industry as a whole, the kind of processing that is being utilized or preferred by people, I'm not so sure if that would be good for this signaling mechanism. Now, I'm going out on a very huge limb here, and I don't have evidence to back it up, but there are certain rodent studies where they've done very simple manipulations in, like, for example, food texture, and you can create some really interesting impacts. Have you looked at those?
Yes, I've looked at some of those studies, and there are certain processes that can do certain things to certain foods that will do interesting things to them, for better or for worse. My whole point has always been, don't use the word process or processed as a demon word. There are, first of all, let's cut the crap. Every food we eat is processed. Broccoli was processed. It was hybridized and grown from these weird little weedy things, and through a lot of intensive agricultural process, it was converted into this weird thing that we have today that would never have existed without our massive interference. Growing is a process. Harvesting is a process. Even then dealing with the plant afterwards is a process. Slaughtering is a process. Hanging meat is a process. Fermenting foods is a process. Making cheese is a process. All these things are processes that most people don't have much of a problem with. So stop talking about processing as if that is the problem. Everything is processed. A big process that we do that massively changes food is called cooking. We've been doing that for quite a while. Massive process. So stop talking about process as if it means demon, and let's talk about what the process is and explain to ourselves, what does this process do that causes a metabolical problem? Bingo. If it doesn't cause a metabolical problem, then I don't have a problem with the process. So that's one of the reasons why I like to focus on these mechanisms. Now, there are corner cases where we say, this does something novel to a particular food that we know our body has never really had before in evolution, at which point, little alarm bells can go off, because you can say, okay, is that doing something that's going to do set off those programming errors that you said? But a lot of the time you can actually say, no, all it's doing is it's getting it into a state where our body knows exactly what to do with it. It's just making more or less of it, and we would have to work harder to get it or whatever. So or it's making it purer, so we don't then have to deal with the heavy metal toxins that would otherwise be inside it. That's a process. Refining awful things out of food is a process. There are roots that people eat in Africa that have got horrible heavy metal contamination, just as part of the normal soil process. And the more processed they are, the less unhealthy they are. So, we mustn't always use that term in this horrible demonization way. I'd say any process that leaves our metabolism as healthy or healthier than before we ingested that food is a process that's fine by me. Similarly, people go, oh, what's a healthy gut biome? I'll say a healthy gut biome is the gut biome in any generally healthy person, by definition. That's kind of how I see processing as well. And people have a lot of problem with this. For example, there's a huge, and this is in my insurance policy as well, huge discussion about sweeteners, and even the very notion of the taste of sweet. Is sweet evil? Or should we punish ourselves by not experiencing the sensation of sweet because it seems too good and we're naughty, sinful people who don't deserve it? Is it? Well, that's the general feeling people have. People feel if I taste something sweet, inevitably something bad must happen because, karma. Well, maybe, but I didn't see the contract the universe wrote with you to make that claim. So let's look a bit more perspicaciously, and let's look at the different effects of different sweeteners. So a sweetener like fructose is going to treat you very differently to a sweetener, say, like erythritol. What does erythritol do? As far as I can tell, erythritol goes into your bloodstream and goes through your kidneys, and you urinate it out. You could recycle it if you were, if you were good at distillation.
We'll look into it.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to do anything to insulin. It doesn't seem to do anything to your blood glucose. It doesn't seem to do anything to your inflammatory markers. It doesn't seem to do anything at all. It just flows through you and happens to tickle your taste buds on the way down. Now, there are arguments that, okay, in tickling your taste buds, your body gets very confused because it's expecting that there's going to be some nutritive component of the sweet signal, which blah, 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 blah. But all of that I've seen is highly hypothetical. It's kind of, again, scientists thinking there's got to be karma here. I'm going to think of ways that karma is going to give us a kick up the backside, and none of it is particularly persuasive yet. Maybe one day somebody will come out, but I've noticed that people who have erythritol generally do not seem to put on weight, do not seem to show symptoms of hyperinsulinemia and those kind of things. So until then, I guess if you need something sweet, that's what I consider a safe way of doing it. Now, other people have complained and said, well, there are other sweeteners. For example, aspartame is created by Monsanto and therefore is evil. I'll say, yes, I will agree that Monsanto is evil. However, aspartame is two very common amino acids joined together. And when they go into your body, they fall apart into those two common amino acids again. And possibly the tiniest amount of methanol, but much less than you get when you eat an apple. I think I discussed this on another podcast recently. It's your job to tell me how two very common amino acids that we get from pretty much all the foods we eat are suddenly going to turn magically dangerous because they're made by Monsanto. It's your job to tell me. You're the one who's claiming that there are devils hiding behind those molecules. Yeah. I'm not saying that. And I need you to show me the devil. Show me the devil, and I'll believe it. Until then, all I know is that aspartame tastes disgusting, which is a good enough reason not to eat it.
My simple analogy is when people focus too much on sweeteners, it's kind of like looking at the big elephant in the room and saying the tail is the biggest problem. It's part of the problem, definitely, but I mean, you should focus on food as an individual. It has multiple components. I have yet to find people that consume sweeteners as is on their own. I believe spoonfuls of aspartame or erythritol, whatever the reason is.
Yum, yum.
It's by far the most disgusting thing ever. So we've tried
even spoonfuls of sugar. You try and eat tablespoons of just table sugar. It's not nice. It's usually when it's mixed with a fat or it's boiled or added with other flavorings or given different texture, even in something like rock candy is where it becomes interesting. Just gobbling tablespoons of sugar is not an appetizing thing to do. That's why Coca-Cola has to work quite hard to, add a lot of phosphoric acid and things to balance it out so you can drink that amount of sugar down in one go without being sick. It's tough. I would say that the most persuasive issue with sweeteners for me is the following. If you eat a lot of salty things, then your taste for salt does go up. I've noticed it. And and things that used to be too salty, you suddenly can enjoy, and things that are not salty at all just taste quite bland. Obviously, something similar happens with sweetness. often the first thing people go onto a keto or similar diet is they say, these things that used to taste like sour berries now taste really sweet. I ate a bit of carrot the other day and it tasted like an apple. Even the cabbage is starting to taste sweet. You start detecting the very subtle sweet flavors in everything, and even in some meats and things like that. And I think that's quite a nice sensation to have. To be able to detect those subtleties can be quite nice and quite useful, rather than kind of nuking your tongue with the sweetness of an ice cream or a Coca-Cola or whatever. So it's almost, I look at it from an aesthetic thing, saying actually your dynamic range is better when you have a subtlety. It's like modern music where they just compress the hell out of it. And that's what our sweet palate is a bit like. And we can get to a better dynamic range. I think we just enjoy our food a bit more. So that's why, even if whatever sweetener you're having, I would suggest train your palate to have less of it, and you'll enjoy a wider range of flavors. I guess these things. So yeah. So for example, I like making custards, egg yolk, cream, and vanilla, and I add these days a very small amount of erythritol just to give it a slight extra sweetness beyond what the cream does, and that's enough to just knock it over the edge. Other people who taste it say the stuff's tasteless.
Yeah.
But I'm happy with that. And I'm not doing that because I think, oh dear, if I had another tablespoon of erythritol in there, my backside would fall out, or I would immediately die of karma cancer. I'm just doing it because A, erythritol's damn expensive, and the less you can use, the better. And B, it means that if I happen to have some sour berries with it, those berries taste sweet as well. So I'm getting a bonus. So that would be my only argument about it. It's not. So what we're really saying is, it's almost turning the usual argument on the head. I'm saying cut back on your sweeteners, not out of puritanism or asceticism or to punish yourself, but out of hedonism, because you'll get a greater hedonic response from a greater number of items if you haven't blasted your palate to sweet hell and back.
What's interesting is I was flying from Hungary back, and I had some fruit, and I had our product on there, and we've cut down sweetness quite a lot, at least on the chocolate version. And then I realized that, hang on a second, this fruit is like, have you tried one of those pineapples that they give you on the airplanes? Those are just way super duper uber sweet. And secondly, please say all of this to a lot of the people who've left us reviews on Amazon. It's kind of interesting because in a food world, your focus seems to be hyper stimulating. Like, okay, the competitor's sweet, I need to kick their ass, and I'm going to go even higher.
Oh, no. And that's a problem with things like Quest bars. They're just too damn sweet, because I think they're competing with the jump bars out there, and they're not allowing their customers to train their palate. Maybe the first time the customers have that thing, they will say it's not sweet enough. And that's a problem for an entrepreneur, and I can understand it. You sometimes only have one deal. It's almost like you need to sell different products. This is the beginner bar.
We did that.
It's the first beginner, middle, and this is the expert bar once you've trained.
You know what's funny is, just to interrupt, we have that model going on. Like, for example, our pecan flavor is by far the sweetest. If somebody comes up and says, okay, I'm transitioning from a standard American diet, here, take this up, this is filled with sweeteners, I don't like it as much. And then level 2, you're now a level 63 mage now, and now you can have the chocolate one. And here's the elite one where you go out and do raids on an epic level, and now you have something that doesn't even have erythritol in there. So
it has to be aspirational, exactly. I mean, it's like, I used to be a real kind of chocolate anti-snob. I like the most crappy, dairy chocolates with all the sugar in it. And the other day, I found myself eating some 100% chocolate and actually liking it, not having to convince myself to like it. The reason it was good is it was actually, those lights flashing there. I've got a little Python program on a Raspberry Pi that flashes the lights on the hour every hour, which means an hour the hour. So it wasn't that you were going mad. So basically, I think that your model is an interesting one, because people will suddenly find that they can just taste and enjoy the chocolate as long as there's enough fat there. What these 100% chocolates sometimes do wrong is they're kind of gritty cocoa mass, and they don't put enough cocoa butter in there. So you get this kind of crumbly cocoa powder in your mouth almost, with none of the nice fats to kind of smooth it out. And the best ones I've had are full of cocoa butter, and then it works. Then even 100% chocolate is palatable. I've had 80% chocolates that, because they don't put enough cocoa butter in, taste disgusting. They just taste like sweet sawdust.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's different chocolates, there's different processes. It can be a whole new rabbit hole. I think that's a podcast on its own.
Dutching, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. It's a whole new can of worms. But let's go back to this final topic that we can just sort of shave off. And if you want to go on lens on it, that's fine. And we can talk about a little bit about evolution. Like, what do you look for in evolution? Where do you stop? And what can be obtained or not obtained from it?
Well, firstly, we need to be careful of just those stories. As people like Ron Rosedale and everybody else has said, evolution doesn't give a damn about us individually at all. It's not Mother Gaia. It's not our mums putting us to bed every night and patting us on the head and looking. No, it's nothing like that. Evolution needs to do one thing. Evolution needs to make sure that we successfully copy ourselves. Because by definition, if we don't copy ourselves, then we're not the ones who are going to win that particular race. There is, however, some debate about how long, and at some point we have to get the hell out of the way so that our offspring are all right, and we're not competing for our offspring's resources, because we can't be eating all their food or using all their resources. So at some point it's very important that we die for evolution to work and for our offspring to be okay. However, there's the sweet spot. Some species, mayflies or whatever, they die pretty damn quickly. They don't need to look after their offspring. The offspring are born. They have lots of them. If many of them die, it doesn't matter, because enough will survive to make their own offspring in this quick chain. With us, and elephants, things like that, we've taken a strategy where we kind of offload some of the instinct into these programs that are written in runtime, so to speak, to get the software analogy, which is, of course, what we call culture, what we call society, socialization, and all that kind of thing, where we say, okay, well, our environments have changed so quickly and we need to adapt to new circumstances so quickly, we can't rely on blind evolutionary instinct to do it. So we're going to have these general purpose algorithms, which we call intelligence, that can then adapt to multiple situations. The problem with those is they take time to bed in. And so individuals who are even useless because they've already reproduced do need to stick around a bit longer. That's why we have grandparents and why women go through menopause and don't immediately drop dead. Because in our species, our massive forebrains need a huge amount of programming before the evolutionary benefit, before they paid for themselves. Because, these big brains cost a damn lot in energy and development, and they take a long time to work properly. Look at a foal when it's born. It can start running around within hours. A human is basically still a baby until they're in their 30s. So we really need that type of programming. So it's not right to say that evolution wants us dead immediately, but it's also not right to say that evolution really wants us to live till 90 years old and live a happy, long life. It doesn't give a damn at that point. So what we're really looking for is, how can we maximize our healthful longevity in a way that kind of takes what evolution did and hacks it so it works to our advantage. And that's why one of the things that works, and you start looking, okay, well, if evolution basically needed us to be around to impart wisdom on younger people, then maybe if we find ourselves in a position of imparting wisdom on younger people, that might have an almost protective mechanism on the individual, because we're fulfilling that particular part of our evolved destiny. And indeed, you find this. Old people who have good social lives, who are able to educate people, whose wisdom is respected, and in societies where old people's wisdom are respected, they live longer, happier lives. In societies where, right, you're retired, you're no longer useful, bugger off to an old people's home, they wither and die. So there we are. We're already getting clues about what would a social species require in order for us to live long, happy lives. Then there are other things. Then we can start having more nuanced arguments. Like Ron Rosedale says, if we eat fat, we're kind of hacking evolution in an interesting way, because when you eat protein and when you eat carbs, you're hitting the insulin, you're hitting the mTOR pathway. Effectively, you're saying, okay, we can burn the candle brightly. We've got all the energy we need. We've got all the building blocks we need. Let's reproduce and get the dam out the way. Whereas fat came a little bit too late in our evolution to send those signals in quite a good way. So our body and the way that as a species we still go into substantial ketosis even when we are full of fat and have enough protein, that fools our bodies thinking, well, I'm not quite sure if we've done everything we should do yet. Maybe we should repair things. Maybe we don't have quite enough protein yet to say we're finished reproducing. Let's put things in stasis mode and see what happens next season. And then again and again and again. So he would argue, eat more fat, cut down your protein, and certainly don't eat a lot of carbs. Other people then say, well, actually, no, you reach a certain age, and if you don't eat protein, your body starts withering away, and okay, you might have a few extra shuddery years of sarcopenic dodderiness, but by God, I want to be like one of those 70 or 80-year-old triathletes that pump themselves full of whey protein and are still up there swimming and running and riding into their sort of, 8th, 9th decade. So, and those are both legitimate arguments. You can look at it both ways. And I don't know the answer to those ones. I guess it's what you're looking for. Some people say, I literally just want to live to, I'm 100 and whatever. I don't really care if I'm in a wheelchair or if I can barely see. I just want to eke out every day of my life. Other people say it's about, I want to live to a certain age and I want to drop dead like within a week. Other people say, actually, I want to be a bodybuilder. I want to just pump myself full of roids. I want to look body beautiful. And I don't care if that takes a decade or two off my life. Those are all legitimate. There's each of those. We each are the artists of our own lives, and we can decide what picture we want to paint. Nobody can criticize us for that, as long as we are being honest with ourselves about what we're doing. So there are people who run lots and lots and lots of ultra marathons, and I've seen what that seems to do to their heart rhythms. It does seem to cause some problems with heart rhythms. I know I've got relatives who've done that, and when they get older, they get various tachycardial problems and things like that. If, however, that's helped them get to that age without having a nervous breakdown because that's their passion, well, maybe a heart that is a bit dodgy by that stage in life is a price they wanted to pay. So I think as long as we are honest, we go in there with our eyes open. Nobody should tell us you shouldn't be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe somebody finds themselves the world's best pastry chef, and they love pastry, and that's their life. And their brief little flicker of existence in the nullity of the void, they want to fill with as many beautiful eclairs and millefeuilles as possible. Well, fine, as long as they realize that maybe by the time they get to their 40s, 50s, 60s, that will start catching up with them. And if they're lucky enough to make it to their 70s, it's not going to be a happy 70s. If they're really honest with themselves, it's like people who enjoy cigars. It's not, as long as they're not saying to themselves, a cigar is a health food and it's doing me good and it's going to give me healthful longevity, I have no problem with that. So I think at some point, with processed, as you like to say, carbs, with seed oils, with junk foods, with all these pleasures that people are getting. Maybe they're not so pleasurable, we'll find out. But at some point, they will just be honest with them like they're honest with tobacco or honest with a cigar. And it's kind of what I do. On my birthday, I'll have a crap load of carbs. Just as I call it the carbnivore. Just on my birthday, I'll eat all sorts of rubbish. Not because I think it's doing me good, but because it's a kind of a one day of chaos, which I know is not doing me any good at all. But I choose to do it just as a reminder of the chaos and in the calm. That's I hope my otherwise metabolism. And I choose to do that not because I think it's any good, but it's kind of one day of theater of the absurd. So everybody can make their choices, but you've got to do it with your eyes open. And as long as you do that, then I think you're being true to yourself, and you're being true to the sort of philosophical honesty that we were talking about earlier on. And that's why learning about your metabolism, learning about the mevalonate pathway, understanding how you've been manipulated by food industries into thinking that strategies are good with a capital G or otherwise are not necessarily the case, is you owe it to yourself, because nobody else is the artist of your life when it comes down to it.
Yeah. Wise words indeed. One thing I would like to add over here is there are those people as well. Maybe they are in a rarity, but people that push the boundaries. They're like, I want to have more than what you're telling me. I want to have a little bit more. Like, there's this one woman who everybody said, hey, sweet food is bad for you. And she's like, I like sweet food. So she made a diet of all cakes. And she lost weight. Now, I don't know whether the health implications for long term are good or bad, but, I think it's in human nature as well for us to go out there and hunt and search for adventure. Yeah.
Well, it's important. That's what our species does well, and it's a slightly sacrificial ambition, but it's necessary for our species. Weirdos who go to the moon and so on aren't doing it for the sake of their health, are they?
Are you one of those?
I'm not actually interested in going to the moon yet, but I'm very glad that other people are. And, she's basically going to the metabolic moon by living her life on cake, isn't she? And good luck to her. And I hope she makes re-entry without burning out.
So sounds good. Do you have anything else you want to talk about real quick, or have we covered basically everything or many things?
Oh, the problem is we could either stop talking now, or we could continue talking for infinity. So now is as good a time as any. I can tell people if they want to follow me online, my handle is @BokkieDog, BOKKIEDOG. That's on Twitter. And my blog is skimmed.cream.org. I ask you to go there and read the post, because then that will shame me into writing some more, which is always good. It keeps you motivated. Currently, I'm doing some part-time work for an organization in the UK that I can't quite talk about yet, and hopefully we're going to be doing some interesting things in the keto realm, so maybe I'll be able to talk to you about them in the new year. Don't worry, I'm not going to compete with any of your products, but hopefully if you visit London, you'll be able to enjoy some of what we're doing. So I'll let you know more next year.
Sounds great. And ladies and gentlemen, this was our 50th episode. I think, Nick, I mentioned to you as well. And you were one of the top people that we wanted to get onto this show.
Wow.
So, and mostly because you have a kick-ass sense of humor and you've combined that with a lot of brains. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to this show. And Nick, you are the best, one of the best.
Really? Just say, I have to tell you, imposter syndrome?
I'm listening.
Imposter syndrome is where everybody basically thinks they're going to be found out, but that they're imposters, even when they're kind of not. Like Einstein would probably suffered from imposter syndrome, saying, "Oh my God, they're going to find out that I'm God, I think I'm a physicist." And I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a chemist, so you can imagine my imposter syndrome is sky high. And I've spoken to other people. Even people like Dave Feldman and others, we all have it. And so you wanted to know, find somebody honest, probe them about their imposter syndrome. I tell you, mine's sky high. So you're saying that makes me feel both very big-headed and also weirdly as if I'm about to be found out by the cops or something. So thanks for that, dude.
Well, you're welcome. And just to kind of add a little tiny bit, I'm picky about the people that get on here, and when I tell somebody who they are, it's usually out of honesty. So I meant that. So Nick, thank you.
And I'm genuinely grateful for that, because I'm always honest. I never ever give somebody praise unless they earn it, so that they know that when I'm praising them it's real, and when I'm criticizing them it's real as well. It's a strategy I recommend to everybody because it makes life a lot easier.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody else. Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium, keto-friendly, and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.